Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Good morning, UCY TV listeners. My name is Jerome Hebert, and I am the Sane Environmentalist. Today, I have Mr. Don Hancock. He is the director of the Nuclear Waste Safety Program and the administrator of the Southwest Research and Information Center. Their website is sric.org. He was the recipient of the 2005 Griff Salisbury Environmental Protection Award for 2 decades of work as a watchdog and advocate on nuclear waste issues. Don was praised as a leader in the effort to prevent the opening of the waste isolation pilot plant in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and later worked to make the WIPP safe. His work has contributed to the imposition of safety and health requirements for the WIPP, and he continues to monitor the WIPP to ensure those requirements are met and to prevent the expansion of the different types of waste that can be disposed of there. So I would like to welcome you. Are you there, Mr. Hancock?
Good morning, Jerome. Thank you.
Why don't you start out, just tell us a little bit about SRIC and what your mission is there.
SRIC, or Southwest Research and Information Center, is a private nonprofit technical assistance and environmental justice information organization. We were founded in 1971. We're based in Albuquerque. We have and continue to work on a variety of issues. It was not founded as any kind of anti-nuclear group, but rather more of a research and information for citizens, to provide information so that citizens could act and community groups could act in their own interests and with adequate information. And so we've tried to continue that. In 1972, however, the Atomic Energy Commission, which is the predecessor of what's now the U.S. Department of Energy, came to New Mexico and announced that the first geologic repository for nuclear waste in the United States would be in New Mexico. So from that time on, a part of what the organization has done is to pay attention to WIPP specifically, and more generally what's going on with nuclear waste around the country. And that includes understanding what's going on, researching what's going on.
Excellent. So as far as the products that are being stored at the WIPP, what kind of products are they storing at the WIPP? Hello? Did we lose you?
Hello? I can hear you. Can you hear me?
No, I can. I guess we just had a momentary snafu.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that.
Sorry. The waste that is allowed to come to the WIPP site, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, is defense, in other words, from making nuclear bombs, trash. It's called transuranic. Basically, that means plutonium-contaminated waste from the manufacture of nuclear bombs. Much, but not all, of the waste that comes to WIPP was generated at the Rocky Flats plant, which is north of Denver, Colorado, which operated
Looks like Skype is acting weird here. I'm trying to work this out.
plutonium bits of the nuclear weapons. About that, as far as I know, everything. So, I mean, it says my sound quality is all right.
Yeah, I think it might just be a Skype thing, maybe on my end, because
Okay.
you keep cutting out. But I don't know if the UCY people can hear you or not.
Okay. Well, I can hear you all right, so I'm sorry to hear that there's problems on my end. So the waste was mostly generated at the Rocky Flats site in Colorado. A lot of that waste that was generated at Rocky Flats was, however, taken to Idaho in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so now much of the waste that comes to WIPP has come from Idaho, but it was originally from Rocky Flats.
Yeah, I grew up about 4 miles from Rocky Flats. So
you know that was a big problem facility from an environmental standpoint. From a U.S. government standpoint, it was a national security site, and it was very important that it continue to operate, which is why when there were fires and other problems at Rocky Flats, to try to pacify or alleviate some of the citizen concern and government official concern about Rocky Flats, that's why they started taking waste from Rocky Flats to Idaho to try to convince people in Colorado that Rocky Flats would be safe, even though it wasn't. And they told people in Idaho, don't worry, the waste we're sending to Idaho will only be there for a short period of time, and then we'll take it away, so that people in Idaho could think that, oh, well, maybe we don't like this, but it's only going to be temporary.
got it. So how are they packaging these products when they're shipping them and storing them?
So most of the waste at Rocky Flats was, in essence, large 55-gallon drum trash cans. So if you can picture a 55-gallon drum, there are lots of them, easy to make. So they essentially were used as the trash cans at Rocky Flats. So I always remind people that most people don't keep track of everything they put into their trash can at home or in their work. Well, there weren't necessarily very good records kept at Rocky Flats of exactly what was in containers. So they sort of knew what was in containers. Because they didn't really know for sure, one of the things that we and other groups argued for in the 1990s, when WIPP was being issued a permit, a hazardous waste permit by the state of New Mexico, that the state of New Mexico shouldn't rely on those records, 30, 40, 50-year-old records, but rather should require things be done to actually check what's in each container before it can come to WIPP.
Would that mean like removing everything from the container and re-putting it in another container?
In all cases, it means that the container has to be essentially X-rayed. It's called videography, to kind of have pictures of what's inside the container. In many cases, it's what you just said is correct. It's also required that the waste be visually, in bureaucratic term, is visually examined. That means taken out of the drum, looked at, and put in, because there are many waste containers that are supposed to come to WIPP that have what are called, under the permit, prohibited items. So the prohibited items includes explosives, pyrophoric things, significant quantities of liquids. All of those things were actually used in Rocky Flats, so that's why there are a lot of drums that have prohibited items. And so one significant reason that you have to repackage containers is that the 55-gallon drum that you have has things in it that are not allowed at WIPP. So therefore, it has to be taken out. Well, the way you take out things, that are in a container is take everything out of the container, repackage things that are in the container that can come to WIPP in one container, and take out the liquids, the pyrophorics. Rigorous process. Now, resolved, unfortunately, was in February of 2014 when one or more containers exploded in the WIPP underground and contaminated the underground mine, very significant parts of the underground mine. After a long period of looking at it, etc., it was determined that at least the major drum that exploded was a drum that was packaged at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico and then shipped to WIPP, and in February of 2014 it blew up. So that was an example. That sort of confirmed that at least in terms of some of the waste at Los Alamos, the procedures that we talked about weren't adequate. So among the things that have happened since that February 2014 incident is there have been additional changes and requirements to both the record keeping and the packaging of a lot of the waste that comes to WIPP.
Gotcha. So what I'm seeing as well is a lot of geologic issues. What are the geologic issues involved around the WIPP, and is it really a good place for permanent, safe storage of our nuclear waste?
We've always had concerns about the geology. The WIPP site is in a salt area. There's lots of salt deposits around the United States. The concept of the reason you would put nuclear waste in salt is, A, there is a lot of it. B, it's easy to mine. People have been mining salt for use for a variety of purposes for literally centuries. So it's easy to mine, so that's a good thing. The fact that there is salt means that there isn't fresh water, at least immediately present, because as anybody knows, if you put fresh water and salt together, the salt will dissolve. So the fact that you have large amounts of salt still intact in the underground means there isn't fresh water. So that's another good provision about it. But there are also problems with salt. One is that salt can be associated with other minerals, and usually that's oil and natural gas. And in fact, the area, the Permian Basin, and WIPP is in what's called the Delaware Basin, a part of the Permian Basin in eastern New Mexico, southeastern New Mexico and West Texas, is it's a major oil and gas producer. It was originally chosen, when it was originally chosen in the 1970s, however, it was known to be near potash mines, but at the time there wasn't oil and gas production going on in the immediate area. Now there are literally more than 500 oil and gas wells within 2.5 miles of the boundary of this site. And in most recent years, there's even started to be fracking to the east of the WIPP site, and over time, there will undoubtedly be more fracking being done around the area. The federal mining of the site.
So I have actually looked at some satellite images of the WIPP area, and I was actually shocked by the number of oil wells that I saw.
Yep.
So couldn't fracking create egress for groundwater to enter the WIPP site, or for other gases or caustics or even injection fluids to enter the site?
Yes. The Department of Energy argues that because the fracking is done at a deeper level, so the waste is being disposed at about 2,150 feet below the surface, the oil and gas production and the fracking is happening considerably deeper than that. So their argument is there's no way that one could interfere with the other. However, we have a real-life situation that occurred about 40 miles away from the WIPP site where fluids were injected and they didn't go where they were supposed to go. And so that could also, and this was an issue that was significantly debated in the 1990s, we had and other people had distinguished geologists and hydrologists that said yes, because the salt at the WIPP site is mostly but not totally pure, and in terms of how it came to be in geologic time when it was an ocean and it was the salt was deposited, there are also layers that aren't salt. Usually it's called anhydrite, which is a So these, that hasn't happened yet, but the more drilling you have, the more fracking you have, the more potential for those kinds of things to happen. Another thing that's important to point out about this site is one of the points of controversy back in the 1980s is that some areas close to the WIPP site, there are pressurized brine pockets. In other words, not all the water evaporated when it was an ocean, and so there are areas that have a lot of water in them. They're obviously brine, they're saturated with salt, but they're artesian, they're under pressure. So there was an argument in the 1980s about whether there were these pressurized brine areas really at the WIPP site, and that was because the first site that was chosen for WIPP did hit a brine pocket long before there was waste, when they were doing exploratory drilling. So they moved away from that brine site to the existing WIPP site and said, oh, there's no brine there. Well, there was evidence that there could have been, so the solution to the problem, of course, is to not have experts argue whether there's brine or not, but to drill a hole and see whether there is. So in 1991, a hole was drilled at this site, and in fact, brine water gushed to the surface, creating what was at the time facetiously called Lake WIPP, of thousands of gallons of water that flowed from about 3,000 feet deep up to the surface because it was under so much pressure. In other words, it wasn't being pumped, just having the whole connection brought the brine up. We're also very again, we're talking about 239 has a half-life of 24,000 years. So that means 24,000 years from now, half of the radioactivity will still be there. So this is a thousands of generation risk. So the fact that something doesn't leak out today doesn't mean that it couldn't leak out in a few years or even a few hundred years, and it would still be about the same amount of toxicity and radioactivity that it has today. So that's a very long answer to your succinct question, but yes, there are geologic problems with the site.
So have there been any other successful salt mine repositories created anywhere in the world?
That's an excellent question, because essentially all of the deep geologic repositories that have other large repositories similar waste in their case nuclear power operations. Both of those sites closed down prematurely because they had operational problems with the site. So the idea of geologic repository is you put waste deep underground and it's going to stay there essentially forever, at least for thousands of generations. Well, the 3 salt mines that we've had operating in the world, WIPP and the 2 in Germany, have all failed in the operational phase. So we don't really know how they would operate for thousands of years in the future because they've all failed significantly during the operational phase. The Swedes and the Finns are currently the farthest advanced nations in the world in terms of trying to develop new geologic repositories for high-level waste, much more highly radioactive and much more radioactive waste than what have been in the German or the WIPP repositories. They're using granite formations rather than salt. Most of the world has now, any nation that has nuclear power has to be concerned with, okay, what are we going to do with the waste? So various nations are looking at various ways, but the United States and Germany are really the only 2 nations of the world that have serious nuclear waste disposal programs underway that are still thinking that.
Interesting. So they use granite. Is that a safer thing than the salt?
Look, as oil and gas, like we talked about at WIPP. Solid granite being solid means it not really very susceptible to earthquakes and those kinds of things, although can through to know how you can protect future generations from radioactive waste that are going to persist for thousands of generations. That's been much more thought through before nuclear weapons and nuclear power was produced in the United States or any place else in the world. Unfortunately, it wasn't. So now we have lots of nuclear waste, and we need to come up with better ways to store it in the short run and transport it and dispose of it in the longer run if we can come up with safe geologic repository sites.
So, speaking of nuclear waste, are they trying to expand the types of nuclear waste that they're going to be putting there? And would you please define for us the difference between remote and contact-handled nuclear waste?
Yes, they are trying to expand WIPP. Since the 1970s, one of the reasons that a lot of people in New Mexico have been concerned about WIPP is, as the first operating geologic repository in the country, it of course could seem attractive for more waste than what it is. So the law, not just people of New Mexico and government of New Mexico that think WIPP shouldn't be expanded, the law, the federal law, the Waste Isolation Pilot, the WIPP Waste Isolation Pilot Plant Land Withdrawal Act, passed by Congress in 1992 after 6 years of debate, by the way, explicitly prohibits any commercial waste of any kind. It explicitly prohibits any high-level waste or commercial spent fuel, the most highly radioactive waste in the country, from coming to WIPP. So that's clearly illegal. There's not any debate about that. But DOE being DOE and other people saying, well, you only got one place underground that's operating, so maybe we should think about putting other waste into it, have had proposals for the last 30 years or so to expand WIPP. They have current proposals. What is allowed at WIPP, and this is to your remote handled and contact handled, as I mentioned, transuranic waste is plutonium contaminated waste. Most of it is alpha and some beta emitting radionuclides, like plutonium, as I mentioned. But there is for some of the processes, you have some fission products, cesium and strontium, that are more highly radioactive, have stronger beta and gamma emissions. And as the name implies, contact handled means I can walk up to a 55-gallon drum and emit radiation. And so rather than the 55-gallon drums, that's more than 95% of the waste coming to WIPP, where you can walk up to it and pick it up if you're strong enough, or move it around with forklifts, which is the way it's done, with people buy it with no protective equipment normally. That can be done remote handled. You have to have containment. It's important to know, however, that because of the contamination at the WIPP site in the underground from this radiation drum explosion in February of 2014, the workers in the underground area that waste is being emplaced at WIPP they look like Ebola workers, if people have seen those. In other words, people are in full protective equipment. They have respirators, self-breathing apparatus, because the area is so contaminated they can no longer just be there without protective equipment and breathing equipment. So that, again, is not the way WIPP or any other repository is supposed to work. So that's now a significant operational problem. And because of the contamination, it also means that as the salt moves around, it's not being protected as well as it used to be. So there are significant, literally tons and tons of ceiling that collapse any day. We're expecting that hundreds of tons of salt is going to collapse within a couple of 100 feet of where workers are emplacing waste. Again, this is a dangerous situation that we think shouldn't be occurring. So yes, these are operational problems, but that's the difference between contact and remote handled waste. And yes, there are numerous proposals in various stages to expand WIPP. And my organization, many other people in New Mexico strongly oppose those and will fight against them, and we'll continue to urge our elected officials in New Mexico and elsewhere not to change the law, to not allow those things to happen, because, as I've said, there are geologic problems with WIPP, there are operational problems.
Yeah, and it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't salt highly corrosive to 55-gallon drums, and wouldn't salt just cause the drums to dissolve over a period of 5 or 10 years and expose the waste to whatever environmental calamity may occur, water, etc.?
Yes, you are correct. Salt is corrosive. It takes a little longer than 5 or 10 years unless you have a significant amount of water to kind of speed up the corrosion process. But the Department of Energy, everybody agrees that all of these drums that are put in the underground at WIPP are going to have been corroded away within a few decades. But the argument is, again, that the salt will contain it. The salt moves around and kind of contains the waste. So the containers are important to store it and to transport it and to put it in the underground. But over decades, the repository is supposed to be closed up, and it is fine at that point for the drums to be corroded. Of course, the corrosion also creates gases, and so one of the issues is the corrosion going to be enough and fast enough to create gases that, kind of pressurize and, again, want to push the waste out? So that's always been an issue. But absolutely, you are correct. There is no debate that the drums are going to go away. The Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency both acknowledge that that's going to happen, but both agencies have said, well, but the salt is going to be good enough that it will contain the waste even though the drums are gone.
For 250,000 years.
Well, that's the argument. We, of course, disagree with that. The standard for WIPP is not 250,000 years, it's 10,000 years, because that's what the Environmental Protection Agency agreed at the time was a long enough standard. The long other proposed geologic repository in the United States, Yucca Mountain in southern Nevada, which is supposed to be for high-level waste and spent fuel, the standard for that site is it's supposed to protect the public and contain the waste for 1,000,000 years. Yucca Mountain is a very flawed site, so I'm not arguing in favor. In fact, I've opposed it for a long time. But it is worth noting that while the waste in WIPP will be dangerous for much longer than 10,000 years,
And I'm so sorry, Don, you keep cutting out. I'm glad that you're long-winded because that is really helping me. And I hope I didn't just interrupt you. But I'm hoping you can hear me as well. You keep cutting in and out.
Yeah.
So,
I hear you just fine.
Well, that's good. So we've basically determined that this is kind of a short-sighted solution to a long-lasting problem. That we've got waste products that are going to be deadly for 250,000 years, and the people who are tasked with our safety are giving it 10,000 years. It's kind of, and I noticed this with the nuclear industry in general. It seems like they're like, we'll just, it's going to be okay in my lifetime, and a lot of people, it seems, are just like, I don't really care, once I'm dead and my grandkids are dead, well, then, I don't know, who cares? So this is who cares attitude. I think that's part of the problem. And do you see any solution to that? Do you see, how do we raise awareness to people that it's a transgenerational problem. It's not an immediate problem.
You're absolutely right. In my experience, people have trouble thinking about long time in the future, and that's pretty normal. But we need to do more than that. A lot of times it's women and children that are most concerned about these kinds of things, maybe because they, are think about those things, which is not to say that men can't be and aren't. But yeah, we need to think long term. And so we need to think, we've created a lot. We, the nuclear industry and the U.S. government through our weapons, have created a very large amount of very dangerous nuclear waste. We need to say we've been creating this waste for 75 years. We need to take a long time process of awareness, education of people, getting people to understand what the dangers are, to look at what the options are, and then to find the best geologic repository sites when we're thinking long term. How you contain the waste for tens of thousands, if not a million years. So that's a difficult process. There are lots of good geologists in the United States and other places, but basically what geologists do is look to see what's underground in order to look for water or some kind of mineral kind of resources. So they're generally looking for what's underground and in order to how to extract it. There's much less work that's done. You mentioned underground injection earlier. There's much less work that's been done in terms of what happens to geology when things, in this case radioactive waste, is put into the underground, and what impacts does that have on that stable geology over time. So it is a difficult technical problem that people need to be involved with. It's not something you can just leave to the experts. Average citizens need to be involved and ask tough questions to come up with better solutions. So I would argue our grandchildren be detected and something can be done about it. But that's not a permanent solution, but that's the best we have in the short run, because we don't have safe geologic repository sites on the one hand, and we also don't have safe ways of transporting. The waste that comes to WIPP is all transported in trucks, because 55-gallon drums and containers like that are not so heavy that they can't be put on trucks and trucked to WIPP. Spent fuel and high-level waste are much more radioactive, so they have to have much more shielding, which means the shipments are heavier. So, in essence, shipments like this could only be done on railroad cars or barges to move it around rather than by trucks. Anybody who has dealt with the railroads knows that our railroad system in the United would start, or shouldn't be moved very much. The high-level waste and spent fuel especially shouldn't be moved very much. It should be secured as safely as possible where it is. In the meantime, of course, technical people and political people and average people need to be involved in this discussion. And in my view, the first issue is to determine what should be the long-term standard. Is the standard at WIPP is one person can die from radiation releases every 10 years for 10,000 years. That's the standard that WIPP has to meet. There are people who would say, well, that's too stringent. One death every 10 years, that's, people die much more.
Yeah, well, and ask the people that die and their family members about that. I'm sure they'll disagree,
Standard should be you ought to have about. So we need to start first with what would be good standard. And then go through a process of figuring out how one would determine what the best sites are. And again, my view, if geologic repositories is a good idea, and if there are a multiple of rock types and specific locations that are adequate, we should look nationally and find multiple geologic sites that would work. So again, to shorten the amount of transportation. Right now, just as a factual matter, when we talk about commercial spent fuel from commercial power plants, 92% of that waste is in the eastern half of the country. Those of us in the West think it's no accident that the sites, whether it's the WIPP site, the Yucca Mountain site in Nevada, sites that are being looked at for geologic disposal are sites that don't have nuclear power plants, and so people in the East want to ship their waste to places in the West. So there are equity issues that come up with that, in addition to just the kind of technical geologic issues that we've been talking about. So again, these are very difficult problems. They require a lot of people being involved over a long period of time. There aren't quick fix solutions for things that are dangerous for thousands of generations.
So what do you think about your idea to do consolidated interim storage? And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So the concept has been for commercial spent fuel and this goes back to the 80s. So since it's going to take a while to have a geologic repository site, in the short run, you put the waste from scattered over about 70 different places around the country into fewer number of sites, so it's consolidated, so you're protecting it in a fewer number of sites. That idea doesn't make sense for a variety of standpoints. Number one, most of the nuclear power plants in the country are still operating, so they're still at some point. We shut down all these plants and stop creating waste, and how do we generate the electricity to replace the nuclear generated electricity, et cetera? Again, these are complicated questions that need serious debate and discussion about. But consolidating waste at a site that doesn't have waste doesn't make any sense. That's expanding the number of sites that have radioactive waste, and it's expanding the communities that can be affected by transportation. So that's not a good idea. There is currently a proposal. There are two proposals before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to license consolidated storage sites in West Texas at a site that's called Waste Control Specialist, which is right on the Texas-New Mexico border in West Texas, southeastern New Mexico. The closest town is about 5 miles, Eunice, New Mexico. And there's a separate proposal from Holtec, a nuclear waste container company, to put a surface storage site about 35 miles from Waste Control Specialists in New Mexico, between the towns of Carlsbad and Hobbs. Again, these are bad ideas. They don't solve the problem. They spread the problem around from where it is to they leave it where it is, and then they transport it around the country to put it on the surface at sites, supposedly for temporary. But when you have a temporary site and you have no permanent disposal site, the temporary site is forever. It makes more sense to store waste temporarily where it is or close to where it is, so it's not being transported, being managed by people who are managing it today, who have experience in managing the spent fuel, have knowledge, equipment in terms of how to shield it and keep it from being released, and frankly, people who have the incentive to keep it safe. If you're running a nuclear power plant, the last thing you want to have happen, you're running a nuclear power plant to generate electricity and get paid for it and make money. The last thing you want to have is a release of nuclear waste at your site, because that contaminates your asset, so to speak. It shuts down your power plant. Look at Fukushima in Japan,
Yeah.
TEPCO, the nuclear utility in Japan, is bankrupt. It had to shut down all those Fukushima plants. So I'm arguing not that they are perfect in what they do, but they're the people who have the waste are the ones who have the greatest incentive to keep accidents like Fukushima from happening. So for that needs to be the case, rather than trying to do consolidated storage in Texas or New Mexico. Nuclear utilities have a licensed consolidated storage site in Utah, west of Salt Lake City, in the Skull Valley Goshute Indian tribe. That they licensed the facility, but it's never operated because of opposition from some members of the tribe and lots of people in Utah who have kept that facility from operating. There have been other proposals in the past in Tennessee and New Mexico and other places to do consolidated storage. They've always been rejected. Ultimately, I think they will continue to be rejected in New Mexico and Texas and elsewhere, so that bad idea should just be dropped.
So, and additionally, if they did come up with this consolidated storage method, wouldn't that just cause the nuclear industry to go, well, now we got some place to put the spent fuel, let's build more plants and create yet more of these fuel bundles? And in my opinion, besides the tanks at Hanford, the fuel bundles that we have right now, they call them spent, but you and I both know they're far from spent. They have tons of energy. They will stay hot for tens of years. Wouldn't it just cause the nuclear industry to want to build more power plants now that we got a safe, quote-unquote, place to put our dirty trash?
It could. That relates both to consolidated storage. As there are replacement electricity options. So yes, I do agree that that's a more sane, rational approach to what we have. We do have to recognize the fact that there is a lot of almost 80,000 metric tons of spent or irradiated fuel that we have in this country. So we can't ignore that it is very dangerous, etc. But as I say, almost all of that waste still is at the operating enclosed power plants. The main thing that is driving shutdown of nuclear power plants that's happening in this country over the last few years and will happen in the future is not only is nuclear power dangerous, but it's also very expensive. Those are somewhat related, of course. To try to contain very dangerous things costs money to do it. So nuclear power plants are being shut down because they are not economic. Wind and solar, energy efficiency, other ways of either not needing electricity or generating it otherwise are much cheaper as well as much safer than nuclear power. So I think over time, the existing nuclear power plants are going to be shut down, some very soon, and some may operate for a while longer. But I think costs are the main thing. But I also agree with you. Some utilities and some nuclear industry people would use the argument if there was so-called consolidated storage or Yucca Mountain or some other disposal site. They would say, oh, this means that we can create more of the waste. Again, I disagree with that.
Yeah, I think that the whole concept of too cheap to meter didn't quite pan out for them.
You are correct. Quite the opposite happened. Now it's too expensive for people to pay for, and people in general don't want to pay for it.
And understandably. Plus we have breakthroughs in efficiency. I think people fail to realize that. You know, if you replace all of the lights in your house with LEDs instead of filament bulbs or fluorescent bulbs, you know, right there you're going to save 30-40% on your electricity bill. So though we do use electricity for everything we use electricity for is becoming more efficient at using electricity. So, you know, I foresee that, just as you say, that it's going to get too costly, too legally difficult to continue to function with standard boiling water reactor, fuel bundle type power plants. Now, I've been doing some research into molten salt reactor technology, which could actually use these spent fuel bundles ground up as a fuel source and then turn it into a 300-year half-life product instead of a 24,000-year half-life product. Have you looked into that at all? And do you have an opinion?
I've looked at it a little bit. Again, I think that is not likely to work from a technical standpoint. I think it is would be very expensive and still be quite dangerous. I mean, molten salt, there is some molten salt around, not in big reactors like you're talking about. But there have been, again, there are technical operating problems. I think what we need to conclude is that nuclear power is something we used for a few decades, but we should be phasing it out as soon as we can. We need to decide that we've created all this waste that's dangerous for tens of thousands of years and figure out how to more safely store it for decades or a few centuries till we can come up with geologic we have generally to create electricity. We have, as you say, we have more efficient, we have better and cheaper ways and safer ways of doing that now. So let's phase out nuclear power. Let's know that we, however, have created a problem that's going to be around for thousands of generations and put time, energy, and money into addressing that problem and not come up with other ways to kind of keep nuclear engineers, present and future generation of nuclear engineers and nuclear physicists working. They're smart folks. They can learn new jobs as well, just like people who used to be blacksmiths for horses and horse and buggy stage. A lot of those people lost jobs, but that didn't mean they can't have other jobs.
Agreed. I think that the age of nuclear, I kind of wove the fact that it was to keep us safe initially. That was the whole idea, was to keep us safe with the nuclear warheads and the plutonium processing. And now the effort to keep us safe has endangered us for the next few thousand generations. It's almost like I don't even know how to wrap my brain around that concept, that what we've done is we've created a monster which is barely boxable. You know, we can barely keep this monster in the closet. And it's going to try to get out. I mean, let's say places like Yucca Mountain and the WIPP. Okay, so we get it all full and we cap it off. What's going to stop somebody in the year 2735 from digging a shaft there and exposing the world to that product? I mean, how can you know what even the language or what the culture or what the world will be like in that many years? How can you plan for that?
Yes, that's correct. And again, that's one of the kinds of things that has been debated. Should you do, when WIPP is eventually closed up, should you take away all the buildings? Everybody agrees the answer to that is yes. But then the question is, should you try to return it to something that looks desolate and nothing questions. Archaeological workers, and if so, what kind, to, as you say, communicate to generations in the future with pictures and language when we don't know necessarily what language people are going to have. Or, as I say, whether it's better to try to make it look like nothing is there so people won't be curious and want to come digging to see what's there. So again, that's another one of these difficult problems that we don't really know what the solution is. I would argue that what there should be are good records available as much as possible. And again, how do we communicate records that deteriorate over time, and even things like hard drives and computer technology that changes and deteriorates over time. But there need to be good records of what's in places to try to inform future generations that we hope would know that something dangerous. You are very cautious because there aren't easy solutions.
Excellent. So, Don, I want to thank you again so much for coming on the show today. We're going to try to have you back, and as things move along, your wisdom and knowledge is very, very important to us. I'm going to wrap it up now. We're going to get ready to get the end music going, and I'll try to actually time it today so I end right before the music. It's not easy to do. So again, thank you so much, sir. I hope that you have a good day, and we appreciate your efforts and all that you do to help keep us all safe.
Thank you, Jerome, very much for helping inform people. I appreciate you and your program a lot.
Excellent. You have a good day, sir.
Thank you.
So that was Don Hancock. As you can tell, he is a very, very smart guy. He knows what he's talking about with this stuff. I have immense respect for the work that he does and everything that he has accomplished in his work, helping to protect us from the WIPP and from generally nuclear waste as a whole. Again, my name is Jerome. I am the Sane Environmentalist. You can catch me on my YouTube channel. I will be doing videos all the time. So you can also check out my I Ching videos if you have a spiritual slant. You might enjoy that. And with that said, we've got 8:58. I'm pretty sure that I'm getting ready to be cut off here and we'll be getting the end music, but I can't really tell. I never can plan this stuff out right. I don't know why. I guess maybe the best way to do that is to actually go to UCY and see what the heck's going on there. And, oh, by the way, what happened with chat? Did the chat break? That's